So today we'll be looking at poverty reduction and rural development and the role of sustainable agriculture in that through a long-run and comparative perspective of basic questions like who farms and what are the linkages between what people do in farming and non-farming within rural areas, and then how that links to what's happening in cities and urbanization over time. We know that to change course, we have to know how we got here. What are the patterns we see when we look across countries? Think about your own individual, your family history, your community history, and look over the very long run as different areas of the world develop over time. We see countries sharing pathways of development that are surprisingly similar in many ways, and yet each one unique in a distinctive way. So that's what we'll try to understand as we walk through the history of who farms, the linkages between farm and non-farm activity in rural areas, and how that links to what's happening in cities. What's most astonishing, really, about agriculture, and sustainable agriculture in particular, is that almost all farming is family farming. More than 95% of agriculture around the world is conducted by self-motivated individual families working together, mother, father, children, relatives, in very small groups in countries with low fertility and small family size, maybe even very large groups. I've worked in the Sahel where many households are 30, 40, 50 people all farming together as a family farm. And this has very deep roots, of course. There's powerful reasons why we don't see much corporate agriculture. We'll talk about that in a second. But family farming dominates agriculture because people have to be so self-motivated every single day to go out to their fields and look and see what is the condition in the field that day, what are the pests, what's the prospects of rainfall, how moist is the soil, in order to make the right decisions about planting, about protecting the crop as it grows, and about harvest timing and exactly what to do with harvests in the off-season. Of course, we do see corporate farms arise, and we see plantation agriculture in the tropics, but they're surprisingly rare. And one interesting thing about them is that they're often very short-lived. So colonialists or other people trying to build a big farm with a hired manager and lots of workers, they'll be founded in almost all regions of the world by ambitious capitalists or colonialists or advocates of collective agriculture in socialist environments. But those enterprises typically cannot compete with a self-motivated family farmer who every day wakes up and goes out to the field and sees conditions as they change. I've been on many plantations that were founded in colonial era and are now bankrupt, had to be parceled out. And we see the history of many crops like cocoa, coffee, that used to be plantation crops and now dominated. Cotton in the United States is a principal example of that, where plantations run with slave labor have been entirely replaced by individual family farms. And we see the corporate model of plantation continue to exist profitably, only in certain circumstances, which are places basically where growing is the easy part. The hard part of those plantation crops is the immediate processing as soon as you've harvested it. So that's most true for tea, for sugar, and for oil palm. Those are conducted, the agriculture for those crops is conducted by hired workers and hired managers on corporate farms. And it's also true to a considerable degree for a lot of livestock operations. It's true for some tree crops, and it's also true for greenhouse operations and some horticulture. But in the main, for the dominant row crops or field crops that make up most of the world's food supply, farming is family farming, whether it's a tiny little rice farm in Taiwan or a huge rice farm in Mississippi in the United States, whether it's a vast, vast wheat operation in Nebraska in the United States or in Australia, or a tiny little corn maize farm in the highlands of Rwanda, farming is family farming. And family farms almost all do non-agricultural work as well, because to rely just on your farm would be very, very risky. And if you succeed at it, it's very hard to get any additional land or water or other things to grow your farm. And so successful farm families add in more and more non-agricultural work as well. The simplest kinds of non-agricultural work would be people who thatch roofs or build houses or make bricks or do other kinds of local enterprises that are essentially artisanal tasks that you might do for yourself but begin to do for your neighbors. But people also are traders. They open a little shop. They begin to buy and sell. And this is true not only in poor countries, but in very rich countries too. In my own experience working in Indiana in the United States in an agricultural university, the farmers in that state and that environment are quite wealthy people, and they would own other enterprises like an insurance dealership or selling agricultural machinery. And each household would have some mix of farm and non-farm activity that suits their particular capability. The farming part of it, the sustainable agriculture part of it, comes from agriculture being an enterprise that turns natural things, natural resources, land, water, soil, into man-made things. And so the central task of sustainable agriculture is to find ways to do that that respond to what we'll see is the extraordinary pressure of rising rural population densities and respond to people's demand for food in ways that are effectively making use of the available natural resources in a sustainable, equitable, and economically as well as socially and environmentally successful way. What we see is an extraordinary variety of kinds of food products coming out of the ground and out of the animal agriculture in any given location, with the non-farm activity that rural farm households have to undertake because their own farms are so limited as a way of earning a living. And typically the mix of things you see is some combination of food crops, cash crops, and non-food agriculture like forest products or building materials and so forth that may be very important in many settings. So while almost all farming is family farming, with the exceptions that I just described, and farm families do both farm and non-farm activity, when farmers go to buy inputs for agriculture or sell their products to others, that's agribusiness, and that's not the same as farming. Input supply, and also product marketing, unlike agriculture, is often an enterprise with large economies of scale and opportunities for companies to grow very big and serve dozens or hundreds or thousands, or in some cases even millions of farmers and non-farm customers with manufacturing activity, with large-scale distribution, big transport infrastructure, and all the business activity that doesn't require the same local knowledge and self-motivation that makes farming a family business. Agribusiness is typically not a family business. Agribusiness is typically very large companies with economies of scale that serve dozens, hundreds, thousands, even millions of customers as they specialize in particular kinds of agribusiness. Typically, input supply companies are not the same companies that buy from farmers and sell products to consumers. And typically, different kinds of input supply companies are highly specialized in farm machinery, crop chemicals, seeds, and producers of food products are highly specialized in different kinds of food products, but then they join together in conglomerates and large enterprises that, as we'll see, can be a major threat to both health, if they choose to produce foods that are relatively not nutritious and healthy, and to sustainability, if they neglect environmental dimensions of what they do, as well as social inclusiveness if they operate as monopolies against the public interest. So the crucial government role here is to protect the family enterprise of the agricultural production system, interacting with agribusiness, which quite naturally and importantly has economies of scale to work efficiently, while addressing those fundamental issues of market power, environmental sustainability, and inclusiveness for economic development. But it's not just farm, non-farm linkages we need to think about. We need to think about rural-urban linkages, because as rural population changes, we notice people fanning out into the countryside, higher and higher up the hillside, further out into desert margins, into forests, into places that in the past were not places that could be cultivated. People might start civilization in a very fertile river valley. But then, as we've seen population growth around the world, farmers have had to spread out into the most remote places with the harshest environments, often escaping disease, moving up into highlands in many tropical regions, often having to seek land wherever it may be in places that are rockier or sandier or more steep hillsides than what they would have cultivated if they had a choice. But the urban activity, the centers of both public administration and services, and also businesses that have scale economies and are naturally located in towns and cities, those may be very, very far from where farmers have no choice but to live. And so the linkage between the rural people, remote and spread out, as they have to be, with no choice but that in order to have land to farm and earn their living and feed themselves, as they seek to acquire the public services to reach the health and education, as well as market opportunities that are in cities, those rural-urban linkages turn out to be crucial for poverty alleviation and sustainable development in the rural area. We see so many different ways that people interact with cities. There's, of course, migration, much of which is temporary, some of which is exploratory. People go to town in hopes that maybe they will find a job. People move to town seasonally, move to town in search of particular services for education or healthcare, and to buy and sell. And the kinds of infrastructure that people need in order to do that are often very simple feeder roads, very simple dirt tracks in the countryside that go up from just a footpath to something that a vehicle could pass over, to, of course, more paved arteries and major roads, and eventually railroads, port facilities, and so forth that link all the cities around the world, as well as electrification, rural telecommunications, and the cell phone revolution that has brought mobile capacity to communities, even those that have no connection to the electrical grid, working off of solar and other kinds of power that totally transform rural-urban linkages for people who have no choice but to live in the isolated countryside.